Spectre Vision Radio.
The downpour lasted almost 2 weeks, but it didn't bother me. Taking care of Meredith meant I barely left home anyway. That wasn't something I begrudged. I wanted to be with her as much as I possibly could. At night, with the rain hammering down on the roof of our remote house out in the country, it sometimes felt like we were the only people in the world. But when the weather finally brightened up, I had to seize the opportunity to go into town for a few things. I told Meredith I'd only be gone for a while, and went out the front door. I was taken aback by what a number the rain had done on the surrounding area. The normally pristine fields looked more like swamps, solid green having given way to mushy brown. I hopped into my car and decided to take it slow, knowing the roads wouldn't be the safest just then. After getting what I needed from a handful of stores, I decided to drive what we called the back way home. We named it as such because the route brought you to a narrow road that ran parallel to the back of our property. It was a newer road than the one at the front, and I thought it would be an easier ride given how much my car had struggled through the mud earlier. But as I neared our property, something caught my eye. Something was jutting out of the mud. The part of it I could see looked almost circular in shape, and though much of it was smothered in dirt, I could see that it was actually gray, or even white. It was clearly something that had been dredged up by the deluge, but I decided to take a closer look and got out of my car. When I was barely a few feet away from it, I realized what I was actually looking at was a human skull. I ran inside and called the police, of course. They told me not to touch anything. When they turned up, I was quizzed by a Detective Matthews, a tall, narrow man with only a small island of hair left on his otherwise bald head. He asked me if I'd seen or heard anything strange around the property that he should know about, but I had nothing of note to share. "What about your wife?" he asked, motioning with his head up to the house. I looked back and saw Meredith standing at the bedroom window, but she quickly pulled the curtain shut when she saw we were staring up at her. "My wife is very sick," I said. "She barely leaves the house." Detective Matthews nodded and offered a commiserating smile, but told me they might have to speak to her at some point. "Anyone else come around here?" he asked. "Just my son, Jared," I told him. "He visits from time to time." Matthews asked me to provide Jared's contact information, which I dutifully did, and he told me he'd be back in touch. Short of breaking the rules of the universe, I'd done everything I possibly could have to keep my wife alive. And my son Jared had been there with me every step of the way. My rock. He kept me going, kept me from crumbling under the stress, pressure, and grief. But I was beginning to resent him. I understood that he was 26, that he had his own life to lead, but I didn't understand his complete U-turn. When there was nothing more the doctors could do for Meredith, she made the decision to leave the hospital so she could die at home. I nursed her best I could, with Jared's help, yet we were all just waiting for the inevitable. But one morning, Meredith seemed a little better. I brushed it off as insignificant, not wanting to succumb to false hope when we'd been told that there was none to be had. But the next day she was better still, and the next. She didn't regain her full strength, hadn't got back to being what she once was. But she was alive, and that's what mattered. That's when Jared started to distance himself from us, barely coming over anymore. I couldn't comprehend how he didn't see every second his mother was still on this earth as a bonus. To me, it was like winning the lottery and refusing to cash the check. I couldn't believe he didn't want to make the most of it, not when we'd seen how fragile life was, how easily it could be taken away. On one of Jared's increasingly rare visits, I decided to ask him what was up. We were alone in the den, sitting there after silently eating sandwiches I'd made, while Meredith slept upstairs. When I asked him what was going on with him, he took an age to respond. "I can't sit here knowing it's in the house," he finally said. "Knowing what's in the house?" I asked. He sank back into his chair and said nothing. "Jared, what's in the house?" I repeated. But he told me to forget it, that he just found that the memories of how traumatic things had been since Meredith's illness made it hard for him, that the house had felt like death for so long, he was finding it hard to shake. While my resentment wasn't completely abated, I felt I understood him a little better. Everyone deals with these things differently, I told myself. As we sat there, the rain started to come down heavy. "You should stay here tonight," I said, getting up to peer out the window. I looked back at him to gauge his reaction. He nodded, but looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. That night I went to check on Jared. Since that conversation in the den, I'd started to feel concerned that he might not be well psychologically, and that perhaps I'd been too hard on him. When I knocked on the bedroom door, there was no answer. I gently pushed it open and found the room empty. He'd clearly decided he didn't want to stay the night after all. But he had left something behind. There was a white envelope on the pillow. As soon as I opened it, I instantly recognized the handwriting as Jared's. "Dad, there are things you should know." That was as far as I got when somebody started frantically pounding on the front door. I went down and called out a demand that whoever it was identify themselves. "Dad, it's me." I opened the door to find Jared on the porch, soaking wet. His eyes widened when he saw the letter in my hand. Without a moment's hesitation, he darted forward and snatched it off me. "Jared, what's going on?" I said. "How much did you read?" he asked, brandishing the letter at me frantically. "Nothing, I literally just opened it," I replied, confused and a little frightened by his strange demeanor. Jared stepped out from under the porch, back into the downpour, and held up the letter so it got completely drenched by the rain. He pulped the soaking wet mess in his hands, and then tore it apart until it was nothing more than tiny bits of mulch that he tossed to the ground. Whatever he'd written, it was well and truly gone. But then, he grabbed me and hugged me harder than he ever had in his life. "I love you, Dad," he said. "You know that. You know I'd do anything for you." "I love you too, son," I assured him. "And your mother and I would do anything for you too." He stepped back from our embrace and his face fell. I'd somehow said the wrong thing. "Please, come inside, son," I said. He sighed and shook his head, water dripping from his face. "I can't," he replied. He turned and walked back into the rain and disappeared into the night. It was around that time that Meredith started to get significantly better. She had a little more life to her each day, until one morning I heard the floorboards on the staircase creaking, and craned my neck round to stare in disbelief as she made her way down without help. A few days after that, she told me she wanted to go for a walk. We made it a daily routine for around a week. It was remarkable, seeing her view the world as if through the eyes of a child, like she was seeing everything for the first time. I think it was as rewarding for me as it was for her. But she turned to me one morning and told me she wanted to go alone. She needed time to experience things again, uninterrupted and unencumbered by someone else's presence, she said. Reluctantly, I promised not to interfere. Her happiness was my main priority. So, she headed out alone for her walk each day, and each day she was gone for longer and longer. I got used to it, but I never stopped worrying. She'd almost been taken from me once, and every time she was out of sight, I feared she wouldn't return. But, to my luck, she always did. One afternoon, I heard her arrive back home while I was upstairs searching for a razor so I could shave. I decided my best bet was to head into town to buy one before the store closed. I made my way downstairs, calling out to Meredith, letting her know where I was going as I pulled on my shoes, which were in their usual spot next to the front door. Meredith also kept her shoes there, and I noticed there was blood on them. By the color of it, it appeared to still be pretty fresh. I went into the kitchen. Meredith had her back to me, making something on the stove. She developed a newfound fascination with cooking since she'd been feeling better. I asked her if she'd hurt herself on the walk, but she said no. I mentioned the blood on her shoes, but she brushed it off, suggesting it either just looked like blood, or she hadn't realized she trampled over a dead animal or something in the woods. I didn't push it. The only thing I cared about was that she wasn't hurt. But I couldn't ignore it when her behavior started to get, well, stranger. I'd catch her staring at me, but not in a loving way. It was more like she was fascinated, almost the way a kid looks at an animal in the zoo, one they've never seen in the flesh before. One night, I awoke to find her just standing next to the bed as I slept, watching me. When I asked her what she was doing, she said she wanted to watch me dream. I asked her what in God's name she was talking about, and she simply said she couldn't find the words to explain. It was around that time that I got a call from Detective Matthews. "Is your wife around?" he asked. "She's gone for a walk," I told him. "She should be back soon." "Why?" My question was met by a long pause, but I could hear Matthews was still on the other end of the line, his breathing crackling through the speaker. "Stay put, okay?" he eventually said. "I'm coming out there." I asked him what for, but he remained tight-lipped and just told me to wait for him, that he'd be with me in around an hour or so. I waited, and every second I did, my paranoia mounted. Why had he asked where Meredith was? My mind raced. Where had Meredith been going when she disappeared on her long walks? Where had the blood I'd seen on her shoes come from? Why had she been acting so strange? And was it all something to do with the human skull I discovered on the perimeter of our property? I managed to convince myself that they suspected her of something awful, that they were going to find a way to take her away from me. I didn't even consider whether she'd actually done something or not, only that I once again stood to lose her. When I heard someone approaching the front door, my stomach almost jumped out through my throat. But when I went to look out the window, it wasn't Detective Matthews I saw. It was Jared. "The cops are on their way. I'm pretty sure they think your mother did something," I said, blurting it out the second he stepped inside. Jared looked more disappointed than surprised. "What do they think she did?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't know," I confessed, "but she's been acting so weird, disappearing for hours at a time." I didn't get the full list of my concerns out, because Jared interrupted me. "There's something you should know, Dad," he said. That line, the first sentence in the letter he'd written to me, the one he destroyed before I could read the rest. "I'm the one who caused this, Dad," he added. I stared back at him, about to ask what the hell he was talking about. But the doorbell rang. Jared disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me to deal with it alone. I opened the door and Detective Matthews stepped inside. After a few stunted pleasantries, his expression changed and he got down to brass tacks. "Who is that woman I saw in the window last time I was here?" he asked. "My wife, Meredith," I said, not understanding what he was getting at. He sighed and his body language shifted, took on a more combative edge. "Sir, we were able to match the dental records from that skull you found," he said. "They matched your wife. Your wife is dead." I was dumbfounded. I just stood there, staring at him. "And I'm thinking you know something about it," Detective Matthews added accusingly. It all got the better of me. Everything I'd bottled up since Meredith got sick. I found myself shouting at him, asking him what the fuck he was talking about, why he was terrorizing my family with this crazy shit after everything we'd been through, when Meredith was very much alive. "You can spare me the performance," Matthews said, unfazed. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." I could see on his face that he believed what he was saying, and I didn't know what to do. But at that moment, as if by divine providence, the front door opened one more time. It was Meredith. "There she is," I cried. "I told you, she's alive." It wasn't until those words had escaped my mouth that I saw that Meredith's hands were covered in blood. Standing just beneath the frame of the open door, she just stared at Detective Matthews. I screamed as he drew his weapon and told her to stay where she was, but she turned and bolted. Matthews ran out after her, but quickly slipped in the mud. I watched from the porch as Meredith ran with everything she had, a strength and power I had no idea she possessed, fleeing the house, disappearing beyond the tree line where the forest began. Matthews scrambled to his feet and took after her. I stood watching until he, too, disappeared from view. I was in utter shock, couldn't even begin to process what was happening. But then, a voice came from behind me. "I created it, Dad." It was Jared who spoke those words. I turned to find him standing a few feet away. "There's something I need to show you," he said. Jared led me up into the attic. He moved over to the far end, near the window, and pried up a couple of floorboards easily with his bare hands, revealing a box stored in the space below. It was a little smaller than a shoebox, black with no markings on it. Jared opened it up and carefully laid out its contents on the floor. I immediately recognized some of the stuff. They were things that belonged to Meredith. Pieces of jewelry, a couple of segments of fabric I recognized as having been torn from her clothing, photographs of her. "I felt like you wouldn't be able to survive losing her," Jared said, looking down at the objects he'd laid out. I was none the wiser. I think Jared realized he was going to have to spell it out as simply as he possibly could. "That thing isn't Mom," he said. "It's the physical incarnation of an idea of her." I stared down at him. "You've lost your goddamn mind," I replied. Jared shook his head. "You heard Detective Matthews, Dad," he said. "Mom is dead." I stood there, suddenly unable to move or speak, as my mind played a slideshow of Meredith's inexplicable behavior. "You know it's true, Dad," Jared said. "You just don't want to believe it." My knees went weak, and I stumbled over to the wall for support. I looked back and saw Jared retrieve one final item from the box. It was a doll. It had the shape of a person, head, torso, limbs all where they should be, but the lifeless, brown fabric it had been woven from was graced by not a single feature, scarily devoid of humanity. "I created it," Jared said, holding the doll. "But now it's become its own thing. It won't be what I've willed it to, any longer. He stared at the doll, which, although inanimate, seemed to stare back. "It's dangerous," he said softly. The next thing I knew, we were down by the furnace. Jared threw the doll inside so it would be consumed by the heat. Meredith's belongings that had been in the box in the attic, I found myself rushing over to him to prevent him from destroying them. He'd clearly anticipated that reaction and was too quick for me, condemning the items to burn. Detective Matthews never did catch up with that thing. As far as I know, it hasn't been seen since. Jared and I didn't tell anyone about what he'd revealed to me in the attic. Instead, we concocted the lie that we'd both probably been fooled by an imposter. We conceded that perhaps we'd wanted to believe that the person who'd taken Meredith's place really was her, that perhaps we'd unconsciously looked past the telltale signs and red flags, wanting to believe our wife and mother was still with us, a kind of collective hysteria brought on by grief. I'm not sure how much the cops believe that, but they have given us a little space, for now. Jared insisted that I move out, that I needed to be somewhere less secluded, less alone, but I declined. I can't remember the reasons I gave him for wanting to stay out here, but the truth is, I'm uncomfortable with my own feelings. I'm not sure, but I think the reason I'm still here is that I'm waiting. That thing I accepted as Meredith, loved as if it truly were my wife. Sometimes I imagine that I hear someone approaching, and when I look out the window, it's her. Sometimes I imagine myself letting that thing back into the house. Sometimes I imagine things are the way they used to be.